Wyoming Territory, July 1878. The land did not forgive weakness. It never had. Out here past the last reliable fence line and the last town with a proper doctor, the earth ran flat and pale under a sun that asked nothing of you except that you endure it. The sky was the color of bleached bone by mid-morning, and the dry grass along the road bent in one direction like everything out here had already decided which way the wind was going and stopped arguing about it. Garrett Malone walked the western fence line the same way he had walked it every morning for 7 years. Not because the fence needed him. The posts were solid, the wire held. He had checked it himself the week before and the week before that. He walked it because his hands needed something to do before his mind woke up all the way, and the mornings were the hardest part. 58 years old, and the mornings had become the enemy. He was a tall man still carrying most of the posture that military service had installed in him, though the years since had rounded his shoulders just slightly, the way a good oak beam will bow when it carries weight long enough. His hair had gone the color of winter ash, at the temples still dark through the crown. His hands were large and capable looking, the kind of hands that inspired confidence in other people. What those people could not see was the faint tremor in the left one, the one that had started sometime around 1866 and never fully stopped. Not visible unless you knew to look. Not debilitating, but present. Always present. A reminder that the war had taken things from him that no discharge paper could give back. He had been a surgeon during the conflict. A good one. One of the better ones if the men he served with were to be believed, and he had learned not to place too much stock in what grateful men said about the person who had just saved their limb or their life. Gratitude had a way of inflating a man's reputation beyond what the facts would support. What the facts supported was this: Garrett Malone had kept more men alive than he had lost, in conditions that had no business producing survivors at all. Mud and lantern light, and the particular kind of noise that a field hospital makes when it is working past capacity, which was most of the time. He had come home from that with his body more or less intact, and something else considerably less so. He did not talk about it. Men of his generation did not talk about those things, and even if they had, he would not have known where to start. What he knew was that, by 1871, he had found himself unable to continue practicing in Philadelphia, unable to keep the tremor controlled enough for the kind of close work that surgery demanded, and unable to look at a hospital corridor without his chest going tight in a way that had nothing to do with his heart and everything to do with memory. So he had sold what needed selling, packed what needed packing, and come west. Wyoming Territory had not asked him anything about his past. That was the primary virtue of a place like this. He had purchased 40 acres outside Laramie for less than the cost of a good horse and spent the first 2 years making it livable and the following 5 making it the kind of quiet that a man could actually rest inside. Small house, solid barn, a well that hit clean water at 30 feet, a fence line that he walked every morning not because it needed walking, but because he needed the walking. That was the whole of it. That was his life. He did not consider himself a lonely man exactly. Lonely implied a want he no longer felt strongly enough to name. He talked to his horse when the mood struck him, and the horse had the good sense to listen without offering opinions. He rode into Laramie twice a month for supplies and spoke to people pleasantly and without particular depth, and came back out again, glad to be home. Some men were built for crowds, and some men were built for open country, and he had long since settled which category he belonged to. The morning of July the 14th, 1878, he had been walking the fence line for perhaps 20 minutes when he saw her. He almost missed her. She was on the far side of the big flat rock near the property's northwest corner, the one that had been there since before any fence, since before any road, a granite slab pushed up by some geological argument from centuries ago and left there like a statement no one had bothered to finish. The rock caught morning shadow from the east, and she was on the shadow side, which was why he almost walked past her. He stopped. She was young. Mid-20s, he would have guessed, though the condition she was in made precise estimation difficult. She was sitting on the rock with both legs drawn sideways, and she was not moving, and for one long, cold second he thought she was dead. Then her shoulders shifted. A small motion. The kind a body makes when it is working very hard just to keep breathing. Garrett did not move toward her. He stood where he was and took inventory the way he had been trained to do, the way that training never fully leaves a man, no matter how many years he puts between himself and the field. Bare feet. both of them cut and caked with pale dust that had dried into a pale gray paste over blood that was darker underneath. The soles of her feet had taken wire and scrub brush and hard ground without any protection, which meant she had been running before anyone thought to give her shoes, or she had left without them on purpose, which meant she had left in a hurry or in the dark or both. Her dress was plain cotton, once white, now the color of the road. It was split along the back from the collar down past her shoulder blades. Not torn in one motion the way cloth tears when it catches on something and you keep moving. Split, deliberately, or worn to the point of failure from movement, which told him she had been moving for a very long time. Her left knee was swollen. He could see the distortion of it from where he stood, the skin dark with bruising already beginning to surface, the joint carrying more fluid than it should. She had gone down on it hard at some point and kept going, which told him something about the quality of what she was running from. Her hair had come entirely loose from whatever arrangement it had started the morning in, and it hung across her face, and she had not pushed it back. She was not looking at anything. She was just sitting on that rock the way people sit when they have run out of decisions. Garrett moved back to where he had dropped his water canteen at the start of the fence walk. He picked it up. He walked back to a point roughly halfway between himself and the rock and set it down on the ground. Then he stepped back. He did not speak yet. He waited. It took her a while to notice the canteen. When she did, her head came up slowly like a person surfacing from deep water. She saw it. Then she looked for the person who had put it there. Her eyes found him, and what happened in them was not relief. It was the particular calculation of someone who has learned that strangers exist on a spectrum, and that the safe end of that spectrum is considerably rarer than people like to believe. He did not move. He did not smile. Smiling at a person in her condition would have been a form of dishonesty, and he was not in the habit of it. She looked at the canteen. She looked at him. She made her decision and reached for the canteen with both hands, and he noticed the way she held it. Both hands wrapped around it tight, like she was afraid someone would take it back, and she drank without wiping the mouth of it first and without lowering it until it was half gone. Water ran down her chin, and she did not notice or did not care, and that told him more than the feet and the dress had. A person who does not notice water running down their chin has stopped being aware of what they look like to other people. That was the particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from distance, but from fear sustained over time. He had seen it before. He had seen it on the faces of men who had been in sustained combat for too many consecutive days, men whose nervous systems had simply filed away the small dignities and were spending all available resources on the basic project of remaining alive. He said quietly, "Nothing bad is going to happen to you right now." She did not answer, but something in the line of her shoulders shifted slightly, like a small amount of weight had been redistributed. "I live on this land," he said. "Been here 7 years. My name is Garrett Malone. I'm not going to ask you to explain yourself or to go anywhere you don't choose to go." She swallowed. Her throat worked visibly with the effort. When she finally spoke, her voice was the voice of someone who had been breathing hard for a very long time and had not quite recovered the mechanics of normal speech. "I need to sit here," she said. "Then sit there," he said. "Nobody's asking you to move." He stayed crouched where he was far enough away that she would have to make an effort to reach him close enough that she could speak at a normal volume. He waited. He had become good at waiting out here. Waiting was what open country asked of you, and he had found that it was the same skill a good doctor had always needed, except that nobody in medical school had called it a skill. They had called it patience, which was not quite the same thing. Patience implied passive acceptance. Waiting the kind he meant was active. It was paying attention while appearing to do nothing. That appeared to surprise her. Something loosened slightly in the muscles around her eyes. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of something adjacent to it, the recognition that she was not at this particular moment being asked to perform or explain or justify herself to someone who had already decided what she was. Her name came out after another silence. "Dillia," she said. And then with the specific flatness of someone saying something that explains everything and nothing simultaneously, "Dillia Vane." Garrett received the name the way he received most things now, without visible reaction. He was familiar with the name Vane the way anyone within 40 miles of Laramie was familiar with it. The Vane family controlled substantial acreage to the south and east of town. Well water rights, a profitable arrangement with the railroad. The particular kind of local prominence that had roots in money but sustained itself through the less visible currency of who owed what to whom. He did not say any of that. He said, "All right, Delia." She seemed to expect him to say more. When he didn't, she looked down at her feet at the state of them, and something moved across her face that was not quite shame but was related to it. The recognition of how she must appear, the way that recognition arrives in a person when the immediate emergency has passed enough for the smaller humiliations to surface. "I've seen worse," he said, because he had, and because she needed to hear it from someone who meant it clinically rather than sentimentally. She looked up at him. "My left hand shakes," he said. "Has since '66. I was a surgeon before that." He said it without drama, offering it as a form of equivalence. "We are both people who have been altered by things we did not choose." Something changed in her face. Not pity, she was too spent for pity, but recognition of a kind. "Can you walk?" he asked. "Yes," she said. Then honestly, slowly. "That's fine," he said. "We'll go slowly." He stood up and turned toward the house, giving her the choice of whether to follow without making it feel like he was leading her. He heard her slide off the rock behind him, heard the sharp intake of breath when her feet hit the ground and her left knee took weight. He did not turn around. Turning around would have been the wrong instinct, the one that said, "I noticed, I'm watching, I'm assessing." He had learned to hear what was happening behind him and respond to what was necessary without making a person feel observed. She followed him, slowly as promised. The house was not much, but it was cool inside and it was clean, and Garrett had a sense that clean might matter a great deal to her right now. He pulled a chair out from the table near the window, positioned it so she could see the door from where she sat, which mattered to a person who needed to know they could leave. He put water on the stove. He got cloth from the chest near the wall. She sat and looked at the room the way people look at unfamiliar spaces when they are trying to determine whether they are safe. Her eyes went to the window and to the door and back to him. He worked without asking her to move or adjust herself, setting the cloth and the water basin on the floor near her feet, crouching down to work on them with the same matter-of-fact efficiency he had once applied to field dressings. The cuts were not deep. The scrub brush had done its work, but not past the first layers. The wire marks were the worst of it, 3 parallel cuts across the outside of her right ankle, clean and straight, already showing signs of beginning to close on their own. He cleaned them without commenting on them, because commenting would have required her to respond, and she did not need to spend anything on responses right now. She watched him work. After a while, she said, "You know what you're doing?" "I did once," he said. "Why did you stop?" He held up his left hand for a moment. The tremor was visible in the morning light coming through the window. She nodded once slowly, the way a person nods when they understand something they wish they didn't have to understand. The sound of hooves on the road outside came to him well before the riders reached the property. He had learned to read that sound, the particular rhythm of horses moving at a deliberate pace, neither hurrying nor casual. A deliberate pace was the gait of men who knew exactly where they were going and saw no reason to rush because they had already decided how things were going to end. He set down the cloth. He stood up. Delia had heard it too. He could see it in the way her whole body reorganized itself, the way a living thing braces when it recognizes a particular kind of danger. Not panic, something past panic. The specific stillness of a person who has been afraid of this sound for long enough that the fear has become physical, has settled into the muscles like a habit. "How many?" she said. It was not quite a question. "Can't tell yet," he said. He walked to the window and looked out at the road. 3 riders, coming from the east, which meant from town, which meant they had gone that direction first before doubling back, which told him something about either their tracking abilities or their calculation of where a woman on foot in poor condition was likely to end up. The lead rider was taller than the other 2, sitting his horse with a kind of absolute physical certainty, the posture of a man who has never once in his adult life had to wonder whether the room would accommodate itself to him. Garrett knew the name before he could see the face clearly, not because he had ever spoken to the man directly, because in 7 years of living near Laramie, the name Weston Puit had come up in enough conversations that the shape of the man had assembled itself in his mind from other people's descriptions. He turned back to Delia. She was looking at him with the question already in her eyes, the one she already knew the answer to. "Yes," he said quietly. "I see them." She pulled her arms around herself, which was the motion of someone trying to occupy less space in the world, and Garrett felt something shift inside him that he had not felt in a long time. Not anger, not exactly. something older and colder and more considered than anger. The thing a man feels when he has stood in the presence of a particular kind of damage often enough to recognize it on sight. And the recognition carries with it an accounting of all the times he had been too far away, or too late, or simply not in a position to do anything about it. He was in a position now. He moved toward the door. Behind him he heard Delia's voice. Small, controlled, the voice of someone who had learned to keep the fear from reaching the surface, because showing it had never once helped. "He'll say I belong to the family," she said. Garrett opened the door and stepped outside. "He can say whatever he likes," he said. "That doesn't make it true." He stood on the porch and watched the three riders come down the road toward his property, and he put his right hand in his coat pocket, and he breathed the hot, still air of a Wyoming morning in July, and he waited. It was Cesaly Holt's wagon that came around from the north track first, which was something he had not expected. She must have seen the riders from her property and known the way people who have lived in a place long enough develop a sense for when something has gone wrong with the air of it. Cesaly Holt was 62 years old and had outlasted a husband 2 hard winters and one genuine attempt by a neighboring rancher to take her water rights through the courts. And she had the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have already endured the thing they were most afraid of and discovered that they are still standing. She pulled the wagon up near the barn and climbed down without being asked, and walked to the barn door and went inside without a word to Garrett. He heard her voice in there a moment later, low and even, saying something to Dillia that he could not make out, but that had the cadence of steadiness of "I am here of you are not alone." That was enough. That was all Cesaly Holt needed to be. Garrett stepped down off the porch and walked into the yard and stood in the open ground between his house and the road, and the three riders came on at their same deliberate pace, and the sun hit the July earth at a flat angle and threw long shadows from the fence posts, and the dry grass was perfectly still. Weston Puit brought his horse to a stop at the edge of the property line. He did not dismount. He looked down at Garrett the way men look at things they have already assigned a category to, and Garrett looked back at him with the specific quality of attention that comes from having spent years in circumstances where reading another man correctly was the difference between a recoverable situation and one that was not. 52 years old, more or less. The scar on the left cheekbone was pale and old, earned in some earlier chapter of his life, and worn since with what appeared to be complete indifference. His clothes were good. Not showy, but the quality was visible in the way the fabric sat, in the way the leather of his gear had been maintained. A man who spent money on the things he used because he intended to use them for a long time. The two riders behind him stayed a half-length back and fanned out slightly on either side. Not dramatically, just enough to fill the peripheral vision of anyone standing where Garrett was standing. Puit said, "You've got a young woman on this property that belongs to the Vane family." Garrett said, "The only thing on this property that belongs to anything is me, and I belong to myself." Pruitt's expression did not change. That was the unsettling thing about him. Not ferocity, not visible anger, but the complete absence of the kind of emotional weather that most men carry on their faces. He was very still in the way that a person is still when they have already worked out what is going to happen and are simply moving through the steps. "Her husband is concerned for her welfare," Puit said. "Then he's welcome to present that concern to the sheriff," Garrett said, "and we can all discuss the nature of it together." Something moved in Pruitt's eyes. Very small. Gone again immediately. "This is a family matter," he said. "It stopped being a family matter," Garrett said, "when she ran 4 miles through wire fence in the dark without shoes." A silence settled between them that had more substance than silence usually does. The horses shifted. One of the riders behind Puit looked at the other one. Garrett did not look at the riders. He kept his eyes on Puit because Puit was the thing that mattered in this yard right now. And looking away from the thing that mattered was a mistake that circumstances did not always give you the chance to recover from. From inside the barn there was no sound at all. Cesaly had gone quiet. Dillia had gone quiet. The whole property had pulled in its breath. The moment held. And Garrett Malone stood in the middle of it in the flat July heat 7 years past, the last time he had been called upon to be the person standing between a dangerous thing and someone who could not protect themselves, and he discovered that the instinct had not gone anywhere. It had simply been waiting the same way he had been waiting for something worth the effort of standing up. Wyoming Territory, July 1878, mid-afternoon. The silence in the yard did not break, it stretched. Weston Pruitt sat his horse with the particular patience of a man who understood that silence was a tool that most people filled it out of discomfort, and that whatever they filled it with told him exactly what he needed to know. He had used this technique for years. Garrett could see the shape of it clearly, the way you can see the shape of a familiar instrument, even when it is being used by someone else. Garrett did not feel it. He stood in the yard with his right hand easy at his side and his eyes on Pruitt's face, and he let the silence be what it was, which was a test, and he declined to take it. Pruitt shifted his weight in the saddle almost imperceptibly. A small adjustment, the kind a man makes when the other man has not behaved according to expectation. Then the one on the left came off his horse. He did it without a word from Pruitt, which told Garrett that the signal had been something other than words. A look, maybe. A tilt of the head. The kind of communication that exists between a man and the people he uses when they have worked together long enough to not need language. The rider was younger than Garrett by 30 years, heavier through the shoulders, and he moved toward the barn with the particular directness of someone who has been told that the person standing between him and his destination is not a serious obstacle. Garrett moved first, not toward the man, toward the fence post on his right where a long-handled digging shovel leaned against the rail left there from when he had been working the post holes along the south section 2 days prior. He covered the distance in 3 steps and had the handle in his right hand before the rider had covered half the ground between himself and the barn door. The man saw it. He adjusted his angle, bringing his left hand up, something metal in it, catching the afternoon light. Garrett did not swing wide. He brought the shovel down in a short, controlled arc at the man's extended wrist. Not the blade end, the handle flat and hard and moving with the full transfer of weight behind it. The impact was the sound of wood on bone, solid and final, and the metal object left the man's hand and hit the dirt, and the man went down on one knee, making a sound that was not quite a word. The second rider came from the right. Garrett turned into it rather than away from it, which was the instinct the war had installed in him, and which most people found counterintuitive right up until the moment it saved them. He took the blow across his left shoulder, felt the impact run all the way down to the tremoring hand, and used the momentum of it to drive his right elbow back and upward into the space where the man's face was. The connection was not clean, but it was sufficient. The rider stumbled sideways into the water trough along the fence line and went over it, taking most of the water with him in a flat spray that caught the light. The pain in Garrett's shoulder announced itself loudly and with considerable specificity. He breathed through it. It was the shoulder, not the joint. Manageable. He turned back to face Pruitt. The 2 men were on the ground, one holding his wrist and not getting up quickly, one sitting in the mud of the spilled water trough, trying to locate his equilibrium. Neither was in any condition to continue. Pruitt had not moved. He sat his horse in exactly the same position he had occupied before any of this had started, and he looked down at Garrett, and his expression had not changed at all. That was the moment Garrett understood something that changed the weight of everything that followed. Pruitt had not sent those men to win. He had sent them to watch. The realization arrived quietly, the way the most significant realizations do. Those 2 men had come at him without coordination, without any attempt at a genuine tactical approach, without even the basic communication of men who were actually trying to accomplish something together. They had come one at a time with enough gap between them that a single man with sufficient experience could address each one before the next arrived. That was not poor planning. Men who worked for someone like Weston Pruitt did not stay employed by being incompetent. That was deliberate sequencing. Pruitt had needed to know what Garrett Malone did when threatened, how he moved, whether he was controlled or reckless, whether he led with the weapon at his hip or found something else, whether he hurt people more than was necessary or stopped at sufficient. It was an assessment, clinical and cold and disguised as aggression. Garrett had just been read. He did not let the knowledge of that show on his face. He stood in the yard with the shovel still in his hand and his shoulder reporting damage in considerable detail, and he looked at Weston Pruitt and gave him nothing useful to work with. Pruitt said, "You handle yourself decently for a man your age." "I've had occasion to practice," Garrett said. Pruitt looked at his 2 men on the ground with the expression of a man reviewing a result he had already anticipated. "No need for this to go further," he said. "The woman comes back with me, this whole business ends here." "The whole business," Garrett said, "is exactly what needs to come out into the open." Pruitt tilted his head very slightly. "Meaning what?" "Meaning I've seen what she's carrying on her body," Garrett said. "And what I've seen is a medical record, not an accident, not a fall. a record of something that happened more than once over more than a little time. The temperature of Pruitt's stillness changed. It was the same stillness, the same absence of visible emotion, but the quality of it shifted the way still water shifts when something moves through it from below. "You're making accusations," Pruitt said. "I'm making observations," Garrett said. "I spent 15 years as a surgeon. I know the difference between what a body looks like when it has fallen and what it looks like when something has been done to it." Repeatedly. He let that last word sit in the air between them. "I'd be happy to share those observations with Sheriff Aldridge." Pruitt regarded him for a long moment. "You want to take this to the law," he said. Not quite a question. The flatness of the statement was its own kind of message, a reminder that the law in Laramie was a quantity that Weston Pruitt had been navigating for 13 years and had not found particularly difficult. "I think it's the right place for it," Garrett said. And here was the thing that Garrett had not fully expected. Pruitt agreed. Not immediately. He let another silence stretch first thinner this time, more like a consideration than a demonstration. Then he said, "Fine. We'll let Aldridge sort it out." He looked at his two men and said their names once each in a tone that communicated exactly what was expected of them, which was to get up and get on their horses and say nothing further. They did this with the efficiency of people who were accustomed to taking clear direction. Pruitt looked at Garrett one more time, something in his eyes that was not quite respect and not quite its opposite, but was something that lived in between the specific attention a predator gives to an obstacle it has not yet determined how to move around. Then he turned his horse and started back up the road toward Laramie. Garrett stood in the yard and watched them go and felt rather than heard the barn door open behind him. Cesaly Holt's footsteps on the dry ground, unhurried and direct as everything she did. She came to stand beside him. "He agreed too easy," she said. "Yes," Garrett said. "That man doesn't agree to anything that isn't already arranged to his benefit." "No," Garrett said, "he doesn't." He turned back toward the barn. Dillia was standing in the doorway, one hand on the frame, the afternoon light falling across her at an angle that showed the full extent of what the morning had done to her and what longer than the morning had done to her before that. She was looking at the road where the three riders were diminishing toward the horizon. Her face was doing the specific kind of calculation that faces do when they are trying to determine whether the threat is gone or just repositioning. "He'll have something waiting," she said. "What do you know about his arrangements in town?" Garrett asked. She looked at her hands. "He has people everywhere," she said. "He always has people. At the courthouse, at the hotel. He had someone at the church, I think, though I never knew who." She paused. "He knew things. Always. Before anyone should have known them." Garrett turned to Cesaly. "You have a wagon here." "I do," she said. "Are you willing to drive it into Laramie with us?" Cesaly looked at him steadily. She had the eyes of a woman who had already made a decision about this day and was simply waiting for it to be confirmed. "Yes," she said. They moved quickly after that. Garrett went inside and retrieved his coat and his medical bag, the one he still kept packed out of a habit he had never been able to talk himself out of, even after the tremor made most of its contents academic. He put the coat on and felt his shoulder protest the motion with considerable conviction. He breathed through it and fastened the buttons. Cesaly helped Dillia to the wagon and settled her in the back with a blanket that she produced from under the seat without any ceremony, the way practical people produce necessary things. Garrett saddled his horse and tied it to the back of the wagon and climbed up to the bench beside Cesaly. They pulled out onto the road heading east toward Laramie. The ride was long enough for the afternoon to shift the sun dropping from its highest position and beginning its slow western argument, the light going from white to something slightly more gold and no cooler for it. The road was dry and the wagon raised dust behind them that hung in the still air. Garrett drove and said little. Beside him, Cesaly said little. Behind them, Dillia said nothing for a long time, and then from somewhere inside the silence of the road she began to speak. Not to either of them specifically. More to the moving air to the distance, to the particular quality of a moment when the acute fear has subsided enough that the longer and more complicated pain has room to surface. She talked about Warren. That was the name she used, though Garrett had not heard it before, and he did not interrupt to ask who Warren was. She talked about him the way people talk about a thing they have been turning over in their minds for years and have never been able to set down. Warren, who had been gentle when they married in 1870. Warren, who had been frightened of his own family for as long as she had known him. Warren, who had stood in rooms where things were happening to her and had found the wall to stare at. "I don't think he's a bad man," she said. "I've thought about it a long time, and I don't think he is. I think he's a man who was afraid every day of his life since he was a small boy, and he just kept making the choice that afraid people make." "Which choice is that?" Garrett said. "The one that keeps them safest," she said, "even when it costs someone else everything." He did not answer that. There was no answer that would have improved on it. After a while, she said, "Weston won't let this go to the law cleanly. He never does anything cleanly that he can do another way." Garrett nodded once. "I know. He'll have a story already. Likely. And people who'll tell it. Probably." She was quiet for a moment. "Then why are you doing this?" It was a fair question. He considered it the way he considered most things now, without hurrying toward an answer that sounded better than the truth. "Because I saw what I saw," he said, "and I'm past the age of pretending I didn't." She received that without comment, but something in the line of her shoulders changed the way it had changed slightly that morning when he had told her nothing bad was going to happen. Not the end of fear, just the smallest reduction of it. Laramie came into view ahead of them, the roof lines visible first, then the water tower, then the main street with its afternoon arrangement of horses and wagons and people moving between errands. A ordinary-looking town in the ordinary light of a July afternoon. Garrett pulled the wagon to a slower pace as they came down the main street. He was looking at the front of the sheriff's office, which was on the south side of the street halfway down the block. There was a bench outside it where people sometimes sat waiting. There was someone sitting on it now. He saw Dillia go still in the back of the wagon before he identified who it was. Her whole body, which had loosened somewhat during the ride, organized itself back into the braced stillness of that morning on the rock. He looked more carefully at the figure on the bench. A man, 30 or so, sitting with his hat in both hands, turning it in slow circles, looking at the ground between his feet, with the concentration of someone trying to disappear into a posture. Cesaly said very quietly, "Is that the husband?" "Yes," Dillia said. Her voice had gone flat and thin. Garrett pulled the wagon to a stop. He sat for a moment and looked at the man on the bench, and then at the door of the sheriff's office behind him, and then back at the man. The man had not looked up. He was still studying the ground hat, turning, with the mechanical quality of a person doing something with their hands, so that they do not have to be responsible for what their hands might otherwise do. Weston Pruitt's horse was at the rail 2 buildings down. Pruitt had not come in behind them. He had come in before them, had ridden faster or had sent someone ahead, or had never actually intended to arrive at the sheriff's office at the same time as Garrett's wagon. He was already inside. Garrett looked at Cesaly. She was looking at the sheriff's office with the expression of someone calculating a geometry problem. "He's already told his version," she said. "Yes," Garrett said. "To Aldridge." "To Aldridge," Garrett agreed. He climbed down from the wagon slowly, his shoulder reporting its grievances with each motion. He tied the horse to the rail nearest the wagon and walked around to where Dillia was sitting in the back, and he offered his hand. She looked at it for a moment, then took it and climbed down. She looked at the man on the bench. The man on the bench looked up. For a moment they simply looked at each other, and Garrett watched something pass between them that was too complicated to be named simply the accumulated weight of 8 years of a shared life that had gone wrong in a particular way. A way that left no clear villains and no clear innocents, but only people who had made a series of choices under conditions that made honesty very expensive. Warren Voss looked back down at the ground. His hat kept turning. Garrett put his hand on the door of the sheriff's office and pushed it open. The room inside was close and warm in the way of small official rooms in summer, the heat of the day having accumulated in it without much means of escape. There was a desk and several chairs and a gun rack on the far wall, and a door behind the desk that led to the cells. It smelled of tobacco and old paper in the specific staleness of a room where anxious people had spent time. Sheriff Aldridge was behind the desk. He was a man of 50 gray at the temples, with the kind of face that had been trained by long practice into a neutral expression that gave away very little. He was not a bad man, Garrett had concluded from their limited interactions over 7 years. He was a man who operated within the parameters that his position and his town allowed, and Weston Pruitt had been one of those parameters for a long time. Pruitt stood near the window. He turned when the door opened, and his expression as he looked at Garrett was the expression of a man who has arranged a room to his specifications and is watching someone walk into it. "Mr. Malone," Aldridge said. His voice was careful in the specific way that voices get careful when the speaker is aware that what he says may need to be remembered accurately later. "Sheriff," Garrett said. Aldridge looked at Delia, then at Cesaly. Something moved in his eyes that was not quite discomfort, but was adjacent to it. He looked back at Garrett. "Mr. Puit has filed a complaint," he said. "What kind of complaint?" Garrett said. Aldridge glanced at the paper on the desk in front of him. "Mrs. Vane is alleged to have taken money and items of value from the Vane household before leaving this morning. The complaint was filed at 7:45 this morning." The room held that information for a moment. 7:45 in the morning. Garrett turned that number over carefully in his mind. He had found Delia on his fence line before 7 o'clock. She had still been breathing hard. She had still been too frightened to drink cleanly. She had been on that rock for perhaps 15 minutes, 20 at most, before he had reached her. Which meant the complaint had been filed before Delia had reached his property, before Weston Puit had ridden out to retrieve her, before any of the events of the morning had taken place in the yard with the shovel and the water trough. Puit had filed that complaint before he knew where she was, which meant he had known she was going to run, had known it was coming, had prepared for it, had written the ending of this story before the day had even started. Garrett looked at Puit. Puit looked back at him with the patience of a man watching the moment arrive in which another person understands exactly how thoroughly they have been outmaneuvered. "I see," Garrett said. Aldridge said, "I'm going to need to ask Mrs. Vane to remain in town while I look into the matter." "While you look into this matter," Garrett said, his voice still measured, "I'd like to submit my own account of what I observed this morning." Aldridge nodded. "You're welcome to do that." Garrett looked at him steadily. "And I will be requiring a formal medical examination of Mrs. Vane's injuries, conducted in this office in the presence of witnesses documented in writing." Aldridge's expression shifted slightly. He glanced at Puit. Puit said, "Dr. Fenwick is available if a medical opinion is needed." The smoothness of it was almost architectural. He had a name ready, a specific name, the only doctor currently practicing in Laramie. Garrett had expected something. He had not expected it to be quite this well constructed. He stood in the warm, close room with the sheriff on one side, and Weston Puit on the other, and Delia behind him, and all the weight of what had been arranged against them pressing in from every direction. And he did what he had trained himself to do in situations where the immediate options were all poor. He breathed. He thought. He looked for the thing that was still true regardless of what had been arranged around it. What was still true was that he had 30 years of medical knowledge that no filing at 7:45 in the morning could alter. What was still true was that Cesaly Holt was standing beside him and had seen what she had seen. What was still true was that Warren Voss was sitting outside on a bench, turning his hat in his hands, with the expression of a man who had run out of ways to avoid knowing what he knew. And what was still true, perhaps most importantly, was that Weston Puit had sent 2 men at him in his own yard not to retrieve Delia Vane, but to assess Garrett Malone, which meant that on some level, in some calculation that Puit ran continuously and automatically on every person he encountered, Puit had determined that Garrett was worth assessing. That meant Puit was not entirely certain how this ended. That was enough. That was the gap between the stones, the one that had not been mortared, shut, the one that if you were the right shape and applied pressure in the right direction, might open into something. Garrett set his medical bag on the desk in front of Sheriff Aldridge. "Then let's get started," he said. "Wyoming Territory, July 1878. Late afternoon." The medical bag sat on Aldridge's desk like a statement. It was old. The leather had darkened with years of handling, the brass clasps worn to a softer finish than they had started with the initials GM pressed into the front panel in a style that belonged to a different decade. It was the bag of a man who had carried it through circumstances that most bags did not survive, and it looked like it. Garrett opened it without asking permission. Aldridge watched him. Puit watched him. The room was very quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when something is happening that cannot be stopped by the people who would prefer to stop it. Garrett removed a folded leather case from inside the bag and set it on the desk and opened it flat. Inside, arranged in the order he had always kept them, were his examination instruments: percussor, probe, measuring tape, forceps, a small glass magnifier that he had carried since his second year of medical school in Philadelphia and had never once left behind. He looked at them the way a man looks at tools he knows the use of, which is to say, with a kind of quiet confidence that does not need to announce itself. He turned to Sheriff Aldridge. I want to be clear about what I am and what I am not, Garrett said. I am not currently a licensed practitioner. My license lapsed in 1872 for reasons that have nothing to do with my competence or my conduct. I was a surgeon for 15 years, including 4 years of field surgery during the war, and I have examined more traumatic injuries than any physician currently practicing in this county. What I am going to describe to you is not a medical opinion in the legal sense. It is an eyewitness account from a man with sufficient training to know what he is looking at. Aldridge said nothing. He was listening with the careful attention of a man who was being given information he had not asked for and was not yet sure what to do with. Puit said from his position near the window, "Aldridge, I don't see why we need a lecture from—" "Let him finish," Aldridge said. It was a small thing, 2 words. But the quality of them shifted something in the room, a slight but perceptible adjustment in the distribution of weight. Puit did not speak again. Garrett looked at Dillia. She was standing near the far wall with Cesaly beside her, and she met his eyes with the steadiness of someone who has decided that this is the moment they have been moving toward, and there is nothing to do now but be present in it. He described what he had observed. He did it the way he had been trained to do it, with specificity and sequence, without embellishment or emotional language, because emotional language gave people like Puit something to pick apart. Facts did not offer the same purchase. A bruise at a specific location of a specific age, as indicated by its color progression from deep purple to yellow-green at the margins on a specific surface of the body, did not become less true because someone in the room found it inconvenient. He described the pattern. That was the part that mattered most, and the part that a man without medical training would not necessarily identify as significant. Individual injuries could be explained. A pattern could not. The distribution of the injuries across the body, the variation in their age, the specific locations chosen, in the absence of injuries in the places where accidental falls typically leave marks, in the presence of them in the places where they typically do not. This was not a woman who had fallen. This was a woman who had been a target, repeatedly, over an extended period of time measured in months rather than days. He said all of this in the same tone he had used for everything else, level and precise and without heat. When he finished, the room was silent. Aldridge looked at the paper on his desk. Then he looked at Puit. Puit said, "Dr. Fenwick can provide a contrary assessment." Dr. Fenwick, Garrett said, graduated from a 2-year program in Cincinnati in 1869. I spent 4 years at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine and 15 years in surgical practice after that. I would welcome the opportunity to compare assessments in front of any qualified audience you care to name. Pruitt's jaw moved slightly, a small motion, the first visible sign of something operating beneath the surface. Cesaly Holt stepped forward. She did not ask for the floor. She simply moved to a position where she was clearly present and began speaking, in the quality of her voice, which was the voice of a woman who had been saying true things in difficult rooms for 62 years and had long since stopped being frightened of the difficulty, made the room accommodate her. She said she had seen Dillia Vane that morning. She said what condition Dillia had been in when she arrived at Garrett's property. She said it without flourish, without any attempt to make it more than it was, which was the account of a woman who had been present and had eyes and had used them. Then she said, "I have lived on the north property adjoining the Vane land for 19 years. I have seen this young woman on 5 separate occasions in the last 2 years in conditions that caused me concern. I did not act on that concern. I am acting on it now." She said it without apology and without drama, as a plain statement of fact and its consequence. Aldridge looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up from his desk and walked to the door that led outside and opened it. Warren Voss was still on the bench, still turning his hat. He looked up when the door opened with the expression of a man who has been waiting for a thing he dreads and has found that the waiting was worse than the thing itself, because at least the thing when it arrives is a specific shape. Aldridge said, "Come inside, Mr. Voss." Warren came inside. He was a younger man than the situation he occupied, which was the particular quality of people who have lived for a long time in the shadow of a more forceful personality. He was thin in the way that anxiety makes people thin, spending more energy on the work of being afraid than the body can comfortably sustain. He came into the room and looked at Dillia for a moment, and then looked away, and then looked at Puit, and then looked at the floor, and the sequence of those glances told the complete story of the last 8 years of his life in about 4 seconds. Puit said his name, once, with a specific weight in the single syllable that communicated a volume of expectation. Warren's shoulders rose slightly, as they had probably risen in response to that particular tone of voice for most of his adult life. Garrett walked to the far side of the room and sat down in the chair nearest the corner, the one farthest from the desk and from Pruitt, the one that put him at Warren Voss's eye level rather than above it. He did not speak immediately. He sat in the chair with his hands on his knees and his injured shoulder making itself known in a way he chose to ignore, and he looked at Warren Voss with the specific quality of attention that is not the same as pressure. He had done this before, not in rooms like this one, but in field hospitals, where young men lay in conditions that frightened them, and the most important thing a doctor could offer was not medicine, but the sense that someone was present who was not afraid of what they were seeing and was not going to leave. The instinct was the same here. He was simply present, attending, asking nothing. Warren looked at him. His hat had stopped turning. Garrett said quietly so that only Warren could clearly hear it. "You've been carrying this a long time." Warren's throat moved. "That's a particular kind of tired," Garrett said. "I've seen it before. It's different from other kinds." Warren looked at the floor. His jaw was working slightly, the motion of a man trying to manage the architecture of his own face under conditions that made management difficult. "I didn't," he started, stopped, started again. "I never wanted—" "I know," Garrett said. He did not know precisely, but he knew the shape of it, and that was what the man needed to hear right now. Warren looked up at him. His eyes were the eyes of someone who has spent years in a room with no windows and has just been shown that a window exists and is not entirely certain they deserve to look through it. He said, "If I ever—" Warren stopped, looked at Pruitt. Something in Pruitt's stillness had changed, grown tighter. The stillness of a man who is exerting considerable effort to appear as though he is exerting no effort at all. Warren looked back at Garrett, and then with the specific sound of a man setting down something very heavy that he has carried for so long, he had forgotten that his arms were tired. He said, "The men he sent to your property this morning, Harker and Dell. He told them what to do before he sent them. Told Harker where to let the injury happen. Told Dell how bad to make it look." The room received this. Aldridge said carefully, "Mr. Voss, I need you to be certain of what you're saying." "I heard him," Warren said. His voice had found a quality it had not had before, something closer to level, as though the act of beginning had made the continuation easier. "Last night, after she'd gone to sleep, he was in the kitchen with Harker and Dell. I heard him through the wall. He said if Malone was the problem, he expected the simplest solution was to have Harker take a broken wrist into town and file assault charges. He said that between the theft complaint on Dillia and assault charges on Malone, nobody in Laramie would be looking at anything else. The silence that followed was of a different quality than the silences that had preceded it. Those had been the silence of uncertainty, of contested ground. This was the silence of something settling. Pruitt said, "Aldridge, this man is Mr. Pruitt," Aldridge said. His voice was still careful, but the carefulness had changed direction. "I'm going to ask you to be quiet for a moment." Pruitt looked at the sheriff with the expression of a man who has relied on a particular calculation for a very long time and has just discovered that one of the variables has changed. Aldridge looked at Warren Voss for a long moment. Then he looked at Garrett. Then he did something that Garrett had not anticipated, though in retrospect he understood it completely. He walked to his desk and opened the bottom drawer on the left side. He removed a leather folder worn at the corners, the kind of folder that holds papers that have been handled many times. He set it on the desk and opened it and looked at the top page for a moment without touching it. Then he looked at Pruitt. "I've had a file on your family's operations in this county since 1874, Aldridge said. "That is not a secret I am particularly proud of keeping. The reason I kept it is that a file without sufficient witness testimony is a liability, not an asset, and every person I had who was willing to speak had a reason to reconsider by the time it mattered." He paused. "I want to be direct with you, Weston. What Mr. Malone has described this morning, combined with what Mr. Voss has just stated, and what Mrs. Holt has testified to, constitutes sufficient basis for me to act on what's in this folder. That is what I intend to do." Pruitt looked at the folder. He looked at Warren. He looked at Garrett. And then he looked at Dillia. It was the first time he had looked directly at her since entering the room, and what crossed his face in that moment was not rage and was not fear, but was something that Garrett found more disturbing than either, which was the expression of a man recalculating. Still working the problem. Even now. Delia looked back at him. She did not look away. She did not flinch or drop her eyes or make herself smaller in the way that she had learned to make herself smaller over years of practice. She stood against the far wall with Cesaly beside her, and she looked at Weston Pruitt with the direct and level gaze of someone who has decided that this is the last time she will be looked at that way without looking back. Pruitt said, "You'll have trouble making anything stick." "That may be," Aldridge said, "but we'll see." He looked at the two men Pruitt had brought, Harker and Dell, who were standing near the door with the expressions of men who have recently revised their assessment of how the day was going to go. "Harker, Dell, you'll be staying in town tonight." He said it with the particular finality of a man who is done negotiating the terms of his own authority. Neither man argued. Aldridge looked at Pruitt. "Weston, I need you to come with me." Pruitt stood where he was for one additional moment, and in that moment, Garrett watched him complete whatever internal calculation he had been running, arrive at whatever conclusion the numbers produced, and make the adjustment that the numbers required. He was not a man who fought losing positions. He was a man who filed information and waited for a better configuration. That was what made him dangerous and what had made him successful for 13 years in this county. It was also, Garrett thought, what would make what came next survivable. A man who fought to the last was harder to hold than a man who could always see the next move. Pruitt walked to the door that Aldridge held open. He did not look at Garrett again. He did not look at Delia. He walked through the door with the measured step of a man conserving himself for a future he was already planning, and then he was gone from the room, and the room breathed differently without him in it. Warren Voss sat down in the nearest chair without being invited to. He sat there with his hat in his lap and his hands flat on top of it, and his eyes on the middle distance of the floor, and he looked like a man who has just put down a weight and is not yet sure how to stand without it. Delia looked at him for a long time. Garrett watched her face during that time and saw the full complexity of 8 years compressed into the expression of someone deciding something permanent. Not a simple decision. Not the kind that feels clean on both sides. The kind that is right and also costs something and knows it costs something and makes itself anyway. She said, "Warren." He looked up. She said, "I'm not coming back." He nodded once slowly, the nod of a man receiving something he had known was coming and had not known how to prevent, and had perhaps in the part of himself that was still honest, not entirely wanted to prevent. "I know," he said. She looked at him a moment longer. Then she turned away, and the turning was not angry, and was not forgiving, and was not anything so simple as either of those. It was the turn of a woman who has looked at something long enough and is choosing now to look at something else. Cesaly put her hand on Delia's arm lightly, the touch of someone who knows when presence is more useful than words. Garrett picked up his medical bag from the desk. He fastened the brass clasps. He held the bag at his side and stood for a moment in the quiet that had settled over the room. The particular quiet that arrives after a long and difficult thing has reached its conclusion. The kind of quiet that is not empty but full. Full of everything that was said and done, and everything that was not said, and could not be undone, and the strange exhausted peace of a reckoning that has finally, after far too long, arrived. He was tired. His shoulder hurt in a way that was going to be considerably worse by morning. He was 58 years old, and he had spent the day doing things that his body had not been asked to do in years, and the body had responded with the mixed report that bodies give when they are asked to be younger than they are. He did not mind. He walked to where Delia and Cesaly were standing. Delia looked at him with an expression that had changed significantly from the expression she had worn on the rock that morning. The fear was still there. It does not go away in a day. It does not go away in a year. It takes longer than that to unlearn the reflexes that fear installs. But underneath it, or perhaps beside it, there was something else. Something that had not been there this morning. A quality of presence, of occupying the room she was in rather than enduring it. "What happens now?" she said. "Aldridge will move on what he has," Garrett said. "Whether it holds in a territorial court is a longer process. But Pruitt is out of this room tonight, and that's what matters for tonight." And Warren, Garrett considered. He told the truth when it cost him something to tell it. That doesn't fix what he didn't do, but it's what he had available to offer, and he offered it. She nodded slowly, processing that with the same careful attention she appeared to give most things. Cesaly said, "You'll come to my place tonight. Both of you if Garrett's willing." Garrett looked at her. "I have a spare room and enough food," Cesaly said in the tone of a woman who has closed discussions with less. And nobody is driving back to an empty property in the dark after a day like this one. He thought about arguing. He thought about his own house and the particular silence of it, and the fence line he would walk tomorrow morning the way he walked it every morning. He thought about his left hand and the way it had been trembling since early afternoon, the tremor more pronounced than usual from the exertion and the stress and the particular quality of the day's demands. Then he thought about the alternative, which was to sit alone in a quiet house with the day's events assembled in the rooms of his mind, which was how the bad night started. "All right," he said. They left the sheriff's office as the sun was finishing its descent toward the western edge of the territory, the light going amber, and then rose across the flatland, doing what light does in Wyoming in July, which is to make the world briefly beautiful in a way that seems disproportionate to the harshness that precedes and follows it. Warren Voss was not on the bench when they came out. He had gone, and where he had gone, Garrett did not know and did not pursue. Some reckonings happen in public and some happen privately, and the private ones are not less real for being unseen. Cesaly's wagon was where she had left it. They climbed in and drove west out of Laramie as the last light held on, and nobody spoke much, and the horses found their own pace, and the road ran straight and pale ahead of them through the dry grass. Dillia sat in the back again. After a while, Garrett heard her breathing change, the specific shift in rhythm that comes when the body finally accepts that the immediate danger has passed and begins the long and unglamorous work of releasing what it has been holding. Not crying, not quite, or if it was crying, it was the quiet kind that doesn't make demands on anyone. He did not turn around. He drove and let the road be what it was, which was long and open and going somewhere, and he let her be what she was, which was a person who had survived something and was still in the early hours of knowing it. The weeks that followed moved with the slower rhythm of consequence rather than crisis. Aldridge moved on what he had. The territorial court was indeed a longer process, as Garrett had told Dillia it would be. Puit had resources and arrangements and the kind of legal architecture that men of his type maintain as a matter of professional survival. But the folder that Aldridge had kept since 1874 had more in it than one case, and Warren Voss's testimony given in writing and witnessed and signed with the specific permanence of a man who has decided that this is the version of himself he is going to be from now on, did not go away because Pruitt's lawyers were good. Garrett rode into Laramie twice that first week to give his own formal statement. He wrote it out in the careful cursive of his medical school training, precise and detailed and organized in the way that only a person who has spent years writing case notes can organize a document. He did not embellish. He did not need to. The facts presented in sequence with sufficient precision were their own argument. Dr. Fenwick, to his credit, declined to file the counter-assessment that Puit had apparently expected of him. Whether this was because his conscience had operated on him in the night or because he had assessed the direction things were moving and decided that his professional reputation was worth more than Pruitt's goodwill, was not a question Garrett asked. The result was the same either way. Dillia stayed at Cesaly's property through that first week and then through the second. She was not a passive presence. She worked, which Garrett had expected, because people who have learned to define their own worth by their usefulness do not stop being useful just because the circumstances change. She helped with the garden and with the animals and with the considerable work that a widow's property requires when it is only operated by one pair of hands. She and Cesaly developed the relationship of two people who have been through something together and have discovered that they are more compatible in practice than they would have predicted from the outside. Garrett rode over most mornings, not always for a particular reason. Sometimes to help with a fence section that needed attention, sometimes to bring what the garden on his own property had produced in excess of what he needed. He and Cesaly drank coffee on the porch and talked about the ordinary things that neighbors talk about, and Dillia was sometimes there and sometimes not, and the arrangement had a natural quality that none of them had designed and none of them attempted to formalize. His shoulder healed in the way that shoulders heal when a man is 58, which is to say, adequately and with a permanent notation in the record of what certain motions now cost. He walked his fence line in the mornings, and his left hand tremored the same amount it had always tremored, and he thought about it somewhat less than he usually did. The formal proceedings against Weston Puit moved through the territorial legal system with the speed that such proceedings typically achieve, which is to say slowly and with considerable paperwork. But they moved. Aldridge proved to be in the execution of his responsibility a more tenacious instrument than his careful neutrality had suggested. He had waited for the right configuration of evidence and witness, and having it now, he used it with the efficiency of a man who had been waiting a long time and did not intend to waste the opportunity. By September, Pruitt's operations in the county had been substantially disrupted. By October, two of the associated charges that Aldridge had been building in the 1874 folder had produced formal outcomes. The larger question of what a territorial court would ultimately do with the assembled case was a question that would take longer than that year to answer. But the shape of the answer was becoming visible the way the shape of a thing becomes visible through fog when you are close enough and patient enough. Warren Voss left Laramie in August. He sent a letter to Dillia through Cesaly's address, which was the only address available to him. Garrett did not read the letter and was not told its full contents. What he was told by Cesaly in the matter-of-fact tone she used for most information was that Warren had gone to his sister's family in Colorado and intended to find work there and did not plan to return. Dillia did not speak about the letter at length. She read it and folded it and kept it and continued with the day's work, which was its own form of answer. One evening in late September, when the heat had finally broken and the evenings had taken on the particular quality that Wyoming evenings get in the turn toward autumn, a crispness in the air that does not yet carry cold, but carries the memory of it. Garrett was sitting on the top fence rail of the western section, the section near the big flat rock, watching the last light go out of the sky. He heard her before he saw her. The soft sound of footsteps on dry grass from the direction of Cesaly's property, which was north and slightly west, and which she had apparently walked from in the fading light without particular hurry. She came and stood near the fence, not climbing it, just standing on the other side of it, with her arms loose at her sides, and she looked at the same sky he had been looking at. The rock was behind her and to the left. He did not think about it particularly. Or perhaps he did for just a moment. The shape of the morning of July 14th assembled briefly in the mind and then released. They stood like that for a while without talking. The sky went from gold to rose to the deep clear blue that comes just before dark in open country. She said eventually, "That morning, when I showed you what had been done, I thought I was showing you evidence of something that had been destroyed." He listened. "I've been thinking about it differently lately," she said. "I think what I was actually showing you was evidence of something that was still fighting." He considered that, the distinction she was drawing and what it meant and why it mattered. The difference between a record of destruction and a record of survival, and how they could look identical from the outside and be entirely different in their meaning. "Not many people get a second chance at that," he said, "at finding out which one it was." She turned to look at him. The light was low enough now that her face was more suggested than fully visible, but the expression was clear enough. It was the expression of someone who has crossed a significant distance and arrived somewhere they did not know they were going, and has found it more habitable than expected. She didn't reach across the fence. She didn't need to. She stood on her side of it, and he sat on his, and the distance between them was exactly what it needed to be, which was the distance of two people who are choosing their own terms. "Thank you," she said. He thought about what to say to that and decided that nothing was better than anything he could come up with. The dark came in the way it comes in open country, not suddenly but gradually, the light diminishing by degrees until at some point you notice it is gone and cannot identify the moment it left. The stars came out the way they always came out here, more of them than most people who lived in cities understood was possible, filling the sky from one horizon to the other with the indifferent and magnificent abundance of the universe, conducting its business without reference to the difficulties of any particular Tuesday in Wyoming. Garrett sat on the fence rail and looked at them. He thought about the morning, about the canteen set on the ground between them, about the shovel and the water trough in the close warm room of the sheriff's office, and the sound of Warren Voss's voice finding its way to something honest, about Cesaly Holt standing up in a room without being asked and saying what she had seen because it was true and because she had waited long enough. He thought about the folder in Aldridge's bottom drawer, all those years of careful documentation waiting for sufficient company. He thought about what it cost to stand still in a yard when three riders came down a road at a deliberate pace, and what it cost to keep standing still, and what that specific quality of stillness communicated to people who understood its language. He thought about his left hand, which was resting on his knee in the cooling evening air, and was not at this particular moment trembling. He did not remark on it. He simply noticed it the way you notice the absence of a sound you have become so accustomed to that you stopped registering it, and its silence when it arrives is the loudest thing in the room. Delia said goodnight after a while and walked back north through the dry grass toward Cesaly's lights. Garrett sat on the fence rail a little longer and let the night be what it was, which was large and quiet and full of the particular freedom of open country, the freedom of a place that does not ask you what you were before or what you intend to be next, but simply provides the ground and the sky and the space between them and leaves the rest to you. He climbed down from the fence eventually. He walked back toward his house across the ground he had been walking for 7 years. The same ground, different weight,